This is Kajol Jadhav and I am here to explain daily current affairs for UPSC Civil Services exam. India's neighbourhood first foreign policy is losing its importance. How the big nations across the world are facing problems from its smaller neighbours. What are the strategic objectives of India's neighbourhood first policy? What are the constraints for India to achieve its goals of neighbourhood first policy? What Indian government needs to do for continued success of neighbourhood first policy? What is the way forward for India? GS Paper 2, India and its neighbourhood relations. In this video, you can find detailed answers for all the above questions. The above article has been retrieved from the Hindustan Times dated December 16, 2017. What is the context about? The Neighbourhood First policy saw some intense engagements with neighbours that were a high point of Indian foreign policy in the recent decades. Recent political developments in Nepal and China's relentless attempts to establish a formal engagement with Bhutan are affecting India's interests. Results of these elections in Nepal and Bhutan are crucial not only for future of these countries but also for India's neighbourhood policy, which has achieved considerable success in the past few years. Internal dynamics in Nepal can be a challenge and India needs to constantly adjust and engage with stakeholders, according to a person who has followed India's South Asia policy. How the big nations across the world are facing problems from its smaller neighbours. All big countries have in reality problems with their smaller neighbours because the disparity in size and power create insecurities in them. China has tense relations with all its neighbours, barring Pakistan with its actions in the East China and South China Seas, exacerbating their insecurities. Relations between the US and its neighbors to the south have been historically antipathetic. Cuba is a prime example of a big country imposing its will on a tiny neighbor. Russia too has problems in managing its periphery. Its western neighbors have found security under the US, EU or NATO umbrella, while the eastern ones resist its control. What are the strategic objectives of India's neighbourhood first policy? Prioritizing an integrated neighbourhood first. Leveraging international partnerships to promote India's domestic development. Ensuring a stable and multipolar balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Act East. Dissuading Pakistan from supporting terrorism. Advancing Indian representation and leadership on matters of global governance. What are the constraints for India to achieve its goals of neighbourhood first policy? India lacks the financial resources to invest in crucial projects in a sustained manner due to budget constraints and compulsions of domestic priorities. There is also a problem of severe attention deficit resulting from an inability to commit diplomatic and political capital to pursue key strategic objectives. Many of India's strategic initiatives in the region often get portrayed in competitive terms, thereby getting into the crosshairs of adversarial or in-course neighbours. The problem is compounded by the fact that India has traditionally displayed a self-imposed unilateral bias in addressing key challenges in the neighbourhood and near abroad. What Indian government needs to do for continued success of Neighbourhood First policy. The success of India's neighbourhood policy will hinge on its capacity to deliver trade or infrastructure. It must develop capability of delivering more, faster and better infrastructure in the neighbourhood. India can be successful its Neighbourhood First policy by adopting a grand strategic approach in addressing key strategic challenges. There should be a clear rationale guiding India's strategic engagements. By moving from a unilateral approach to tackling problems to a multilateral approach. By creating a regional or global consensus on key challenges. What is the way forward for India? Neighbourhood First cannot be the basis of foreign policy, especially at a time when the world's most powerful country believes in America First. India needs investments and access to technology. It needs to fulfill its defense needs through imports and Make in India projects. It must secure its energy needs and defend its interests in international trade negotiations, besides seeking reform of the international financial and political institutions to obtain its rightful say in global governance and so on.